There you
Hi,
are.
Okay.
everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, Dean Carter, for joining us. And without any further ado, here's Professor Mara Kolesas.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is my big pleasure to introduce the last event of the second part of the Conversatory on racism. Do not despair. We will have a part 3. It's going to have a different sequence, but it was just approved. So I'm very happy to announce that. And I am even happier to have here today Dean Prudence Carter talking about a topic that is very, very dear to my heart, education and racial inequality, not only academically, but also personally and politically. You've read her bio. Dean Carter was Dean Carter of the Graduate School of Education at UC Berkeley, also taught at Harvard, at Stanford. Her books include Keeping It Real, Stubborn Roots, Closing the Opportunity Gap. Her work is truly interdisciplinary: sociology, economy, history, psychology, and touches upon race, class, gender, and inequality. What I like the most, if I may say, about her work is that she challenges binaries, disrupts comfortable assumptions and language, is not intimidated to conceptualize difficult problems, even if they're challenged in academia and certainly in political circles. But if I have to describe her work, and I'm going to take this liberty because I can, is that not only does she look beyond the tree to look at the forest, but she also takes, attention to the rain, to the wind, to the sun, and also describes the smells, the temperature in the air, the wind among the leaves, right? The intangibles and the textures of what makes the forest a forest. And the metaphor is for education. So pleased to have you here, Dean Carter. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Professor Kolesas. And what a poetic introduction. I've never had one as extraordinary as that one. So thank you for that generous and warm introduction. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I doubt that, but I'll take it for today.
Well, seriously, it was so poetic. Thank you.
So it's great. It's great to have you here. Your work really touches every single stone you haven't, left untouched, regarding education. But let's start with some slides that you want to share with us, because this is a good trigger to open up all the issues that relate to education. What you refer to as the ecosystem of education.
Yes, well, thank you. I mean, I start my work by trying to think more recently. I've been thinking at a kind of more interconnected and ecological framework that many call. Some refer to this as the ecology of inequality. A more positive spin is to think about what the ecology of opportunity would look like in order to reduce the kind of fundamental and gross racialized and class disparities that we have in American education. And some of these patterns are global. They're not just in the US, and they are related to the historical systems that have been put in place in societies in the modern era. And particularly as we think about racialized formations like the United States, I think about the work that I've done in South Africa, where there are some convergences. And there are also places like in Brazil, which is another place that has had its history with a very racialized and racist past as well. And so I've been thinking a lot about the connections among thinking from the macro level, what's happened in our history, what happens in politics, and the intergenerational transmission and accumulation of disadvantage. Mm-hmm. And then I think about how that shapes how we run our institutions, our communities, our neighborhoods, our schools. And then even if you burrow down even more at a kind of a micro level, how that shapes our intergroup interactions, our interpersonal interactions. And that all has an impact on how we keep the processes going in reproducing either advantage and privilege or disadvantage in our society. So one of the things that is most astonishing to me, these are not my data, and I'll share my screen right now, is
Mhm.
to look at the results from the largest data set on American schools and testing in the United States right now. And that was developed by some researchers at Stanford University, my former colleague there, Sean Reardon, and his team. And what they've been able to show, and I'll show from this particular slide, and this is looking at, sorry, that's gone too far, but this is looking at data of all the school districts in the United States. Every last one, they were able to get and amass over 40 million test scores over uh, decades. And they were also able to create a composite measure of the material resources in those districts, how wealthy on a scale. And so if you look here, and I hope you can see my cursor, you'll look here, they standardize all these data across all the districts in the United States and standardize the measure for the resource context of the districts. Anything to the right of the zero are the more affluent and advantaged districts, meaning they're much greater or higher above the mean or median of our society. These are median data. And then anything to the left are the poor and disadvantaged districts. This dotted line here shows what's the national average. No, they're using median, so pardon me. The national median on these test scores, right? And then anything below it means those districts on average are scoring, the medians are lower. And anything above it, those districts, the median is greater. What they have found, which is the most profound to me, is that there is not one district that is to the left where the majority of the students are socioeconomically or economically marginalized, where the median test scores are higher than the national median. All of the districts that are above this line are considered more middle class, affluent, or advantaged neighborhoods. And what they can show is that there is a really high, really high, almost to the point that you're measuring the same thing, correlation between the socioeconomic status of the district and their test score outcomes. So that our most economically disadvantaged districts in the country, for the most part, and it's not to be overly deterministic to saying to be poor means you're going to have bad test scores. That's not quite the case, because there's variation across those districts. Some poorer districts do better than others, if you see the spread here, and the same for the affluent districts as well. Some of them do better than others. But what they have been able to show is that a concentration of poverty and a concentration, or alternatively or conversely, a concentration of advantage actually mirrors what you're going to see in terms of the metrics we use to measure educational success for districts, to measure educational success for schools, and more specifically, if you get down to the student level, educational success for students. Now, these, you'll see me having pointed out the bigger, larger districts. The bigger the bubble means those are the larger districts. There's New York, there's Los Angeles, there's Detroit here, really a district that's been struggling. There's Cleveland. If I go to the next slide, this is California, and you'll see where our districts actually fall. So this little tiny bubble here is Berkeley, but here's Los Angeles, our largest district. Oakland is here. And then there's Cupertino and Palo Alto up here. So what we're seeing is that the resource context really matters. And what we know is that the resource context of districts mirrors this housing patterns, which is why the ecology matters. It also mirrors who lives in those, and this is highly racialized. So economic and racial segregation actually feed into those patterns that we have. And that consequently has an impact on the kinds of resources, and consequently also the disparities that we see that are often labeled as racial differences and or class differences. And now we conflate the two. And the reason why we tend to conflate the two is because 2/3 or so, it is nearly 2/3 of Black, Latinx, and Indigenous youth in this country under the age of 18 live within 200% of the poverty line in this country. The same is not the case for white and Asian youth, where nearly just about a third of students or less live in those lower socioeconomic strata. So I think it's important for us to understand the correlations between these racial classifications, how they correspond to class status, and also how they correlate to context. So I'm going to start right there by saying that we have opportunity disparities. And my work has been trying to draw our attention to the what I call opportunity gaps with my colleagues in the book that you mentioned, as opposed to trying to focus and place the onus on the groups themselves. What we are expecting in American society is kids who are grown into context. I'll use this as an analogy. It's like if you have a bunch of kids on an elevator that's going at the rate of a bullet speed train. Some are actually assigned to escalators that are moving slowly and steadily in well-oiled cogs, and some are on stairwells with missing steps and handrails. And we're telling all of those kids to get, on average, to floor 16 at the same time. But they have radically different modes of transportation and mobility. Now, there is the case within the groups that are on the broken stairwells that some of those kids are extraordinarily innately talented and fast, and they will still survive and be resilient. But on average, the members of their groups on those stairwells cannot nearly get there as fast as the kids on those elevators and those escalators. Because and that's the analogy I use to try to illuminate, elucidate what we're dealing with in American society and why we must work on the inputs and stop thinking so much about the outputs, because the outputs are determined, the test scores, the college going rates, they're determined by the inputs, and that's all resource based.
Yeah, I that was going to be my next question, and I'm not surprised that you addressed it already, because the language, by shifting just the language from achievement to opportunities, the shift is bringing in the economics of education, and also the history of why we are where we are, and also the sociology of groups. So the language itself that we use to describe certain things in the school system already eclipses, right? Mm-hmm. The structure of opportunities and the differential access to resources that mm-hmm. kids have. Can you explain how or what are these kind of macro external opportunity kind of gatekeepers or sorters, if I may use that word, that prevent, racialized minorities to get into the fair access to education?
So there are two things that I want to parse out. One of the problems that we get into in American education is we create the idea of education as a private good. We're competing with each other. Groups are competing with each other. And really what I hope that we can, by the end of this conversation, is understand why education is really more of a public good. And it's important for us to invest in it evenly and equitably, or more equitably for all people, so that we can have a healthier nation. Well, what is the case is that because of the historical accumulation of disadvantage, we don't have an even opportunity or even an equitable. And at this point, we need to be talking about equitable, because as I just mentioned, that kids from particular ethno-racial backgrounds, Black, Latinx, Indigenous, are already doubly as likely to be living within the poverty line or within 200%, meaning they're either working poor, or they're poor and unemployed, or they're even worse than that. Many of them are food insecure and homeless. And so you compare that to kids where we know, you talk about the macro level things, we know that what's racialized in our country is wealth transmission. Mm-hmm. So whites at this point are 7 times more likely to have greater wealth than Blacks in this country, and 5 times more than Latinx. And it is the case that even whites without a college degree have a higher degree of wealth than Blacks who have a college education. And part of that is explained by what has happened historically. So in the 1950s and 60s, actually post-World War II, it's important to understand this. And I believe you had Ira Katznelson as a part of your series. Well, he has written an extraordinary book about how affirmative action was once white, right? And part of that was institutionalized by the government. When the GIs came home, Black and Latinos GIs were not able to avail of the federal housing mortgage programs. And because of segregation, they couldn't go to the colleges and universities everywhere throughout. And the historically Black colleges and universities couldn't absorb them all because they didn't have enough spaces. And so what you had was the creation of suburbanization of America, the creation of the American middle class post-World War II, people buying homes, being able to pass those through the generation to their kids, enable their kids to have a little bit of something to go off to college, and just build that and reproduce that after generation. Now, I'm not saying that happened to everyone, but on average, that did happen for whites in this country. Comparatively, that has not happened. And I argue that that is a missed moment of opportunity in American society to have recalibrated everything after Jim Crow, after the end of slavery in our society. So we haven't really had that moment. So the macro problems are that we haven't had a moment to really recalibrate and redistribute. And I know that that's a politically fraught term and people don't want to hear that often, but you can't possibly ask people who've been set behind for generations in terms of disadvantage to catch up with people who are already 3 to 4 times ahead on average in groups. And that's racialized. And it's racialized because it was also de jure. It was actually legal in the 1950s and 60s until we had civil rights acts to come through, until you had the Federal Housing Authority to come through and actually defy and get rid our society of redlining and racist banking processes and stuff. So that all matters to education because that sets up the context for the development of school districts.
Right, and at some point, I don't remember what I read that you said or you presented somewhere that we've moved a little bit. I would say not that much, because the jure. I mean, we cannot expect that the jure equality, right, is going to translate into de facto equality of opportunities, right? And fair opportunities. So these are accumulated disadvantages that not get swiped away with equality. So we have here the issue of equality and the issue of equity. And I want to move to the issue of equity. I know it's a complex, concept and related to racial desegregation, because it was after Johnson as well, that we have Little Rock and we have Brown v. Board and the desegregation of schools. But if I'm quoting you correctly, you argue somewhere, I can't remember exactly where, sorry about that, that schools are more actually segregated now than they were. And the interesting point, to put it mildly, that you make is that this is not only about social resources, but it is about the intangibles. It is about cultural resources, is about the narratives that we tell about each other, about the school, about the teachers, about intergroup, about interpersonal. Would you elaborate on this?
It's a really good point. So when you try to then connect the dots in the system of disadvantage, or even the ecology of opportunity for those who are privileged, you have to think about, well, how is it sustained? How does it reproduce itself from decade to decade? And part of that is supported by what happens culturally in our society. There are ideologies that are in controlling narratives about groups that we subscribe to. And every last one of us collude in some ways in these forms of inequality. So for example, because we subscribe to the idea of social mobility and the belief that you have to have a good school to get into a good college, to get a good job, we start to practice and pick up and accept tacitly understood practices, which is, where am I going to buy my home? And I don't want to buy a home in a neighborhood that has a certain percentage of people who have already been stereotyped as being non-worthy or not high achieving. And so we make these day-to-day decisions about where we're going to live. And those of us with privilege can choose to live in neighborhoods that are segregated economically, which is more likely to be racially segregated. But that those ideas that guide and shape our behavior is the cultural. Their dominant, controlling ideology about who's worthy and who's not. It is so hard. And that ideology is also built on a system of beliefs and stereotypes and biases that are propagated within us and among us in our social networks all the time. So the social networks mediate how the structural work and what happens in bigger society and how we behave at an individual level. And I think how we make sense of it is what our intentions are good because we're just trying to do the best by our families and our own children. But what we're doing is maintaining a system of ideas that are exclusionary, that are boundary. And so I think when I start to talk about the intangibles, I'm talking about what's inside of us. How do you measure? And also, you're talking about how do you do this in a society that is predicated on individual freedom, that's predicated on the ideas of choice, that's predicated. And part of that has to do what we have to disrupt the cultural narratives. And the cultural narratives, as I've just shown, one of the most problematic narratives in our society is the problem of the idea of a meritocracy. It is the idea that we have so-called objective measures of who deserves what. When I've just shown you that test scores in and of themselves are not wholly objective. If you can afford to get your kid a tutor or an expensive test score prep for them to yield and help, if you can afford to take them on vacations, which I can do every summer, or expose them to incredible cultural capital, then you already have an advantage that the average Black, poor, and indigenous child doesn't have. So it's not wholly independent of the kid and their innate ability. It's how we have constructed culturally what it means to be successful. And that's malleable. That's changeable. Yeah.
That is changeable. And I'm sorry I interrupt because
No.
I know in your personal history, because I heard you, I mean, you spoke to the district in Berkeley a few years ago. And you said that you're an example of that you grew up in the South and that you grew up and you did very well in high school, but you got like a 50%, 60%, I don't remember exactly, SAT. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And look at you now, right? Like a professor gave you like this booklet and said you can do it. And it's like a portal, right? Like in science fiction. It is like the key to this different universe. Otherwise, we can kind of, speculate that you would have stayed maybe, where you were in that same line.
Well, so the social capital matters. And that's the other advantage of having so for a lot of kids who grow up on the stairwells and even the escalators, which are not as fast as the elevators, were the intervening powers and forces that will allow those kids to get to the floor 16, to get to the upper academic mobility, sometimes it's external. It may not be the family. It could be a teacher, or it could be an organization that the student was exposed to. It could be a pivotal moment of some access to knowledge. And this is why social networks, who's in your community, has always mattered. We sociologists talk about social capital because we're passing resources, even if they're non-financial, through information that can actually translate in the long term to material gain and advantage. And in my case, I had a high school teacher. I mean, my parents were not poorly educated. I come from a solidly lower middle class family. My parents were poorly paid Mississippi teachers. But they didn't know anything about the selective colleges and universities in this country. We did not have that on our radar. But there was a high school teacher who saw the potential in me and said, I want you to figure out how really competitive you are. You're doing everything in the curriculum we offer you very well. And it's not a challenge for you. Let's see how well you could do if you're in a harder environment. And so she encouraged my parents to send me to a summer program at an elite boarding school that put me on the trajectory that I was on. But if it hadn't been for that teacher watching, I'm not sure where I'd be today. And in terms of the testing, I was a valedictorian of my class. I was a straight A student. And I did well on tests for the most part, most of my in elementary school. But when it came to the SAT, I took it one or two times. I didn't take it 4 or 5 times. I didn't have test prep. I didn't have anything. I just took it blindly. And yeah, I scored well enough to get into college. I think that admission officers saw this. I was from the state of Mississippi, high achieving, um, but it wasn't stratospheric. And there's some belief now in our societies, here, certainly here in California, that if you on average don't have the stratospheric, then you're not worthy, that you're underachiever and stuff. There are tons of kids, and that's my point, who are high achieving, who are not high test scores. And as a former admission officer, I say conversely, there are a lot of kids with high test scores who are not high performing once they get to college.
Yes, definitely. I mean, like a small anecdote to this point. I mean, for you, maybe college was not in the imaginary horizon. And I have worked in outreach at UC Berkeley, where, like, many native Spanish speakers see manual work as the worthy work, right? And then they can make it. And the son of a friend of mine found out once that college was not mandatory. And he, because, university professor, he went up to his parents and said, "You lied to me. College was not mandatory," because this is the imaginary. He grew up all his life with this, cultural capital, thinking that college is what you do, is there in the cards for you.
Yeah.
So that was a huge thing. You also talk a lot about ideology, and I really like that, because the ideology has bad connotations in the US for some reason, as opposed to a more kind of continental, tradition of thought. And you talk about ideologies as idea systems, not only mediating groups. That is something that I would like you to address, but also about the purpose of education. So these meta ideologies, this narrative that we have about the goal of education, is what serves as kind of a sorter of what we're going to do. And at the core of this, there is a relationship between public education and private education, the individual and the market, right? And the idea that, it's a zero-sum game. Would you elaborate on this?
Yeah, sure. So let me start by giving a shout out, so to speak, to the work of David Lavery, who was my colleague at Stanford, because he wrote a really interesting book with a framework about kind of the dominant paradigms of frameworks that we use to understand education. In the early part to mid part of the 20th century, it was about really the massification of education, late 19th century, early 20th century, as we were, the Industrial Revolution, making sure that we had enough human capital in the society to be innovative, to be technological, that you needed literacy and numeracy and mass public education, right? And so it's more economically efficient to have a literate population. But, around 1983 or so, and I love history, so I hope you don't mind my spewing these things. But, when the Nation at Risk report came out under President Reagan's administration, there was a lot of angst in our society that ensued, because the United States didn't look like it was as globally competitive as other countries in terms of student level outcomes. And this is when we started to enter into a really massive accountability era, because we had to have our students as the smartest students. And so we started really relying on these tests. We started to see a framework that was building up around competition. Individualism was being stoked even more, accountability. And this idea of social mobility was really, really so highly connected to testing and accountability in good schools. And good schools meaning they didn't have Black and brown kids in them, and that they had to have a lot of upper income kids in them. And so this social mobility framework started to ensue. And then, but if you think historically, during the period of Horace Mann and others who were thinking about education for the democracy, education to promote and engender the cultivation of a nation of citizens for the health of the democracy, that kind of idealistic framework didn't pick up for very long. It was early on in our school building in this country in order to build a nation. But now we see today, arguably, that we are at a point of a crisis moment, because we have a lot of palpable social division, and it's racial and it's class based. And we don't have a lot of coherence right now. It's bifurcated. If we look at how the elections have had, where people really invest in education as really trying to stitch, to bridge, to teach us about social differences and how to model that and how to compromise in that. So education has lost that focus around democratic equality, if it ever had it. And there were some points in the early part. So it's this social mobility. When I use ideology, you're right. It is a set of narratives, a set of ideas that we've all bought into about why we go to school. What's the purpose of school? And it's very materialist. We send our kids to school so they can be productive citizens. We don't cultivate in this country a love for learning itself. We don't necessarily cultivate a love for learning for the health of the democracy so that we know how to grapple and deal and engage in social difference. We do it so that we can be a more productive and a richer we in the next generation or in the next developmental stage. And that has created a host of problems because it creates and foments competition and division.
Yes, I agree with that, but I think that that's really related to an individual methodological individualism that is like the cornerstone of the society, and the other cornerstone of the society is slavery and exclusion. So when you put those two together are actually reflected in the system of education that we have today, even if it's public education, because it's still based on individual mobility. Even, I mean, I wouldn't expect anything different from private education, but at the core, and we were discussing with you the other day, that actually even public education, because the public is not prioritized right over the individual, so it's the right over the good, as opposed to, you know, the collective good over the right. You have the graphic that you show at the very beginning. It's not a determination, but it's a very strong correlation. And you have a system that it's not public. It is de facto a mixed system because we parents pay privately into the system. In many cases, for the advancement of our individual kids. In Berkeley, is slightly different, but maybe, right?
Right. And yeah, so some of us are trying to ameliorate, although the foundational issues and factors that go into building the foundation are already problematic. And then we try to reform on top of that. The foundation already has fissures and it's broken. And we try to add band-aids or fix or fill in with reform band-aids that are not going to solve the problem until we actually can get it. Now, but let me go back to something that you've described, because I think it's really radically important in this moment as we're contending with anti-Blackness and structural racism in our society to be very much, I think we have to be honest. We have to be frank. We have to be direct about what's happened. When American society was being built, American society was not thinking about the Black person, the person of African descent. It was not even thinking about the indigenous person on whose land we stand, and I acknowledge that. It was not thinking about the people who were affected by conquest and those who are part of, you know, Mexico and who are, you know, Chicana ancestry. So I think it's important to think about when the rules were laid out, the norms were made out. Surely in a time when the United States was in there was a legitimation crisis around World War II. How could you be telling the rest of the world what it needs to do for rights and freedom when you have done this to your own people who are living on whose backs your nation was built? That the United States had to grapple with that. And so 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, interestingly, the justices were not interested in integration, but they were convinced that there was trauma and there was psychological warfare on Black people because of segregation and Jim Crow. It's not that they care for the society. It's not that they care for redistribution. And it's not that they care for equality for all, but they were convinced that this was in violation of the Equal Protection Clause under the 14th Amendment in some ways. And so And it took some psychologists to talk about the Brown doll test and stuff, Kenneth and Mamie Clark. But I found a piece, and I gave this talk, and I talked about this a while. The justices went back and forth proactively talking about whether we should call this integration versus desegregation. And they knew that integration was too radical of an idea. So it became about desegregation, which was about spatial mixing of spatial proximity. But integration, I would argue, and I've argued this in my work, never really happened in American society. Because what integration should do, it means that you're actually going to pull all members of society to the center and include and be of, for, about all of them. But what we did was, you can come here, you can accommodate, we can accommodate your presence, and you're going to assimilate, but we're not going to attend to the fact that you already have such vast disparities in your past. And there's a lot that you don't have compared to the average family here. So we've been trying to, that's what I mean by the Band-Aids. We've been trying to make up for the past with Band-Aids that haven't fully recalibrated so that we don't really have equal chance in American society. And I've seen analysis that say it could take 100 years for us if we keep going. I don't want to say that because people say, well, what's the solution? I can tell you what the solution is. It's just got to be more radical than what it is. So you're right about the mix of the public and the private and the ideology. But I also would add, do we actually have the philosophy and the heart and the principle in our aspirations? Because I'm not sure if many do.
I don't agree that this, I don't agree that it's true that many do. You are more diplomatic, than I am. But I mean, you talk also about, the issue that diversity is not integration, and this is crucial. You just mentioned this kind of spatial coincidence, if I may put it in these terms, that has kind of put the Band-Aid. In your work, you use a lot the word feeble, that I really like, because it's not a word that I say, and I like how it sounds, and it really caught my attention, and it comes over and over and over in your work. But it's basically, we use multiculturalism nominally as well. We do not uphold radical inclusion, right? And there are all sorts of policies inside the school, right, that foster this spatial coincidence, so to speak, but that tend to reproduce and maintain the boundaries among groups. One is tracking. There are many more, and I would like to hear more about that, if you may.
Sure. So let me just go back to my screen and share this. Because you're right about that. There are forces that I wanted to. Oops, there it is. And this is something where I argue that diversity is neither integration nor inclusion, because this is what has happened. And it's happened, post Brown, there was a struggle and a lot of resistance in the country. And the southern states actually desegregated more rapidly than other parts of the country, though there was some form of desegregation and diversification of students in northern and western parts of the country much earlier. But so here you have, on the left side, the overall racial composition. Just crudely, these black and white figures can be any number of groups. But what happens is, when you get into schools, and this is what happened, it was a secondary level of segregation. Tracking became an organizational mechanism that was used to create dual and oppositional educational experiences for kids by race and class, but mostly by race. And to some extent, we can say you'll see a little bit by gender, depending on if it's in math and science courses. But we know for a fact from the research that the lower tracts were more populated by the historically non-dominant groups, and mostly Black and Latinx kids. And then the higher tracts were populated more by white and increasingly now Asian kids in our society. And it is these mechanisms that have actually, in the way they can be framed legitimately, is that we use another, in terms of the framing, we use other forms of another kind of meritocratic framework about who deserves to be in and out. The policies themselves can exclude In many places, you have to test into them, or where the bias can creep in more is that the teachers themselves have to recommend, and oftentimes that can be subjective. You can also have a lot of parent power, parent cultural capital, where parents are themselves actively lobbying for their children to be in certain sectors of the school. This happens with gifted and talented as well. There's so much documentation about who has the power and control to do this. And so we've seen historically where you've created disparate experiences, even in so-called, people use integrated, but I'm going to call them diverse schools or desegregated schools, is the actual segregation of school of children within the tracks, the ability grouping within schools. Another place where I've seen that is also in terms of extracurricular activities. So in the last book I wrote, comparing high schools between the US and South Africa, which also went through this more recently than we did, we saw the extracurricular activities, which are conducive to academic mobility. You know, in some of my schools, basketball and baseball were to black boys and white boys respectively, as cheerleading and stepping, which is a form of dancing, were to white girls and black girls respectively, right? So that even just, or who was an orchestra or Model UN, or all the things that kids pad their resumes with, the concerted cultivation that middle and upper middle class parents use so that their kids could look good to admission officers in selective colleges and universities. Those things in many high schools, if they are diverse, can be racially stratified. And so I found evidence of that in my work. And so those are some of the intangibles when you're getting at it, because unless you're inside the schools, you actually don't know these things. You don't see it. And kids themselves make sense of it that seem to be very benign in ways that have been.
Yeah, no, I was going to ask you whether that's a point that you made about the US, not about South Africa, because my understanding is that in South Africa, there was no tracking, and there was an ideology in the constitution after apartheid in 94 about radical inclusion.
Mm-hmm.
So there were other forms of like grouping, but not the ones that are more pervasive and detrimental, right? Like in the US.
Well, so not like in terms of academics, because the South African education is more nationally standardized and centralized. And so all kids exposed to the same curriculum in theory at the same time and in the same grades across the country. Now, when I first arrived in South Africa to do the work, they did have a form of tracking. It was called higher grade, lower grade. But at some point, the higher education administrative officials, the educational officials in the country realized that mechanism was stratifying in a way that was undermining the radical inclusion principle, I believe. And so it was discontinued actually while I was there. In this country, we've never done that. We have 13,000 different school districts. Most of our action happens at the state and local level in education. The federal government doesn't really govern that. And so we still have tracking very much, and it's a cultural currency in our society. But to answer, when it came to extracurriculars, yeah, like which kids were playing soccer versus which kids were playing rugby. And rugby was the white sport in South Africa. Soccer was a black sport in South Africa, right? And so, but that just created the social boundaries. It didn't really have long-term educational implications like it does here.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. So I'm very interested in your sense about the reproducing the boundaries. I mean, you work extensively about this, about cultural capital. You take after Bourdieu, and pass it on. About the concept, cultural capital, and how boundaries are defined, and these are subtle, intangible, but they have pervasive effects, and sometimes with the best of intentions. Yeah. I mean, the system reproduces, right, and maintains these things, and it keeps on doing more and more of the same. And I'm mixing two questions that I wanted to ask you here, but let me go to the first. I mean, something very telling is that there was a survey kind of in Berkeley tracking students, and you would expect that talent is, reproduced evenly, among groups. So that was the case when they entered kindergarten. By third grade, I'm talking about math, the achievement was incredibly tilted, not only in racial terms, but also in gender. The exception of only one elementary school whose principal, I can tell you the details, but there was a particular program that this particular principal and that particular time pursue. So already they start in the same, because what you talk about is that when people start, you know, with shackles on the one hand and with wings on the others. But here we were talking about more or less the same starting line. Of course, you have preschool, education of parents, right? But they were more or less in the same line. How are these differentials created by the school system, if I may say so?
I actually, and so I've seen those data too, and I would say that it was important. And I asked the district to push to figure out what the explanations are, and I think they can be variable from context to context. I actually think you can't underestimate the power of the family resources too. At a certain point, arguably, if I were to hypothesize, because I can't tell you exactly what happened in Berkeley, but it is the case that we know that children are can be, you know, in preschool it's all about play. At a certain point, the parents, there's a lot of anxiety for, because we want our kids to be competitive in the middle and upper middle class. Many parents want their kids to be competitive. We start to invest and pay more attention to what our kids are being exposed to. But I think it's also important also to think about inputs in the school. So let's move to the most fundamental and critical input. That's the teacher. And we know from the research, and it hurts my heart. It hurts my heart so much to see this. I have seen it because I have a young child, and I see very early on who's getting sanctioned for discipline problems, who's being sanctioned is not being up to speed, where the implicit biases come, who gets called on or called out, because I mean, they're antsy at 6 and 7 years old, right? Mm-hmm. And I am so fundamentally now sensitive to child development and early child development, trying to teach myself even more about it. But I do believe that the biases start to creep in very early on. It's not to believe, the research shows it. We actually have data to show that 5-year-old Black boys across the country are much more likely to be suspended and expelled. Who expels a 5-year-old from first grade or kindergarten? Because they taught back or they're hitting. I don't know about you, but I know my kid went through a hitting spell. You know, you teach them, you socialize them not to. So there's the adultification of young Black and brown children very early. And that is a psychological term. I just realized that, adultification for young children. Mm-hmm. But white children are actually allowed to be children. And so I can't help but wonder how much of this could be parsed out in terms of teacher bias in the reading. Here's where we go back to ideology and controlling narratives about kids. If they're already contending with narratives about that they're bad or they're not good students or they're going to be trouble or they have a lot of baggage, then that affects how teachers relate and talk to them. And that also affects the children's engagement. And so I'm not casting aspersions here, but I know that the data show enough for us to know that there are some really, this is where the intangibles, there's some problems that we have to grapple with. Jason Akonafua, who's one of my colleagues here at Berkeley in psychology, and Jennifer Everhart, a MacArthur Grant Award winner at Stanford, they have been able to show in their experiments how young children can be dehumanized by their teachers. That impacts their educational outcomes. Young Black children.
Yeah, no. Yes, I agree with that. I mean, you work a lot about on how to engage, how important it is to engage the non-dominant culture. And I'm saying non-dominant, not because I'm putting like any value, but as a de facto thing, right? Like I want to make that clear, right? The kind of dominant culture is the white culture. That's the default when so how can you engage, right, the non-dominant culture, first of all, and second, how can you do it without being patronizing? Because many times I've seen different, particular groups being assumed that they were so and so with the best of the intentions, right? Like being engaged and participant, but making all sorts of assumptions about, those groups.
Well, first, one of the things that I have to do, and I try to be careful to do in my work, and thank you for that question, is this is where we conflate race and class a lot. there is a perception when if I use the term Black or Latinx or Indigenous, there's a presumption that we don't have class heterogeneity. And the reality is there are upper, middle, low, middle, working class, working poor, and poor folks among in these groups. Not as many in terms of the distribution, but certainly there are. And there are also different ethnic groups. And so we're all really variegated, but unfortunately, we get homogenized in the American experience across these different racial classifications. So, how do you speak to different groups? It may depend on the intersections of identities. I try to speak and articulate things intersectionally, but I think that what's analogous in some ways, when we start to think about engagement of children, I think gender is a comparable system to think about some of these issues. Like, why is it that girls and females, or those who have been classified or identified as female, often have a difficult time in the STEM fields? What's going on in math and science, right? In terms of their subscription to math and science, it's certainly not. We know from the research that they're not less smart or less competent or less capable. They are quite as, and it's getting better in the numbers in terms of performance. But still, the returns are not as great when you get to the higher ed levels. And so you asked me about what it is about groups. I think it's a lot more fascinating. We need more work about how families make sense, because it is the case that a lot of communities actually are more deferential to the educator population and community and just allow the educators to make the decision. Whereas more affluent white middle class parents are more hands-on and more domineering and dominating. I hear this from teachers all the time about trying to make the decisions. And so sometimes it's the case that we do have a home culture mismatch as well, or different experiences in school. And one of the things I think about, and I haven't seen it examined, is the extent to which young parents today who had really horrific experiences in schools themselves, and now that they have children, they don't trust the school system, how much they can engage with a system that didn't do right by them when their children are in school. Mm-hmm. Like, that really is something that I think is a serious question. A lot of the youth who were I would say abused, and I put that in quotes, but who were just not treated well in their own educational experiences, have to send their children to school because it's mandated, because of, up until a certain age, and they don't know how to deal with the system, and they don't trust the system. And I think that's real. And so they don't necessarily feel as empowered. And then there's distrust with the teachers and the family. But I think what I worry more about, and to be honest, about what we can control in schools, because I know people ask about that. I know in American public education, 75% roughly to 3/4, not quite, of our teachers are white and female. And then more than half of the students in public education across the country are classified as students of color. You already have a cultural mismatch just because of the differences in backgrounds. And so one of the things I know we have to do in schools of education and credential programs is train teachers better to understand the differential political and economic and social realities. We know that culturally relevant and culturally sustaining pedagogies are really critical to the long-term engagement. The research shows that, how well students do. So part of this is about how you orient, how you think about your children and the diversity, and that's beauty that they bring, as opposed to trying to create a standardized, homogenized experience in the classroom.
Yeah, that's crucial. That's an excellent point. I see that. I mean, I don't want to go into the details of the book, but in one of the chapters of your Closing the Opportunity Gap book, that is an edited volume, I think it's Patricia Gándara who writes about bilingualism, and she says, you're trying to homogenize under the English language, where like all the science actually shows that bilingual kids are more capable, not only, neurologically in terms of making synapses and connections, but also culturally in terms of empathy, in terms of, understanding. And instead of treating that as an asset, you treat that as a handicap, right?
That's right. That's right. And this is one of the things that I will say that I envied about being abroad and studying in South Africa, where there are 8 official national languages. We don't have a national language here. English is the dominant medium of speaking and instruction, of course, but um, it's the official language. But it's what I find is that when you go outside of this country, children are taught to speak in multiple languages, particularly when you look at our peer nations. And that's a good thing to try to create cosmopolitan polyglots, right? People who speak multiple languages. I envy that. The only time it's valorized in the United States is when it pertains to the privileged and the affluent who are college going. Now, I find it so stunning that if you take an AP Spanish, Italian, French, whatever it may be, and you if it's about going to a college or university, then it's valorized, highly valorized. But when it comes to children whose native language is not English, or in Spanish, or it's Chinese, or whatever it may be, that we literally stigmatize those children in this country when they should be just as celebrated. And so this monolingual ideology, here we go with that concept again, because it's an ideology, it's a belief, and it also unfortunately reproduces the stereotype about the United States as an anti-intellectual society. You, you, we know from the science. So then what we have to do, and this is what I really find problematic, we have to have the scientists to say, well, there are material benefits to being bilingual. There are material benefits. See, it helps the brain. It'll keep your health long term. No, there should be more than that. We should be just proud that people can communicate with each other from a humanistic perspective across the globe. Why don't we value that in this society? So I'm puzzled by it, and at the same time, I'm heartened that other nation states have actually they cultivate this among their people.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I do not understand how in California you don't have by default bilingual education, or
That's right.
like a mandatory language. Well, I would say Spanish because it's my language, but it could be any other language. Prudence, this is great. I have way more questions, but I wanna leave the audience to ask you questions. So I encourage you to submit the question via the Q&A function. So the first question that I have is by Laura Babbitt. She has been recently elected to the school board in Berkeley. She's having her first board meeting today, actually, Laura. And so this is her question. Hello, can you talk more about the resource inputs we need to put into our public school programs to get better outcomes? Thank you for this informative session. So here you have a policymaker.
Yes, I appreciate that. So when we look at the inputs that are there, I struggle because I'm going to be honest with you. I struggle because the outcomes we're generally talking about are test scores, and I'm not a fan of test scores. I think they have robbed so many children of the joy of learning and their potential, because we've used them to stigmatize the groups. Whenever you're comparing groups, by the way, you're going to always have someone who's going to be below the average and above the average and at the average, right? Just because that's how statistics work. I first think we need to get rid of tests for comparative purposes and use them just for diagnostic purposes to see where our kids are in terms of growth, and stop publishing these data and comparing groups, because it's not based on what I've just shown. This is historical accumulation of disadvantage, and you're never going to, if you keep feeding and fomenting the public imagination, which is already fundamentally flawed about peoples, by feeding these test score differences, it's a problem in my estimation. So at the same time, we need to support communities. There are a lot of children who don't have a sufficient amount. I do applaud the Berkeley and Oakland school districts for what they're doing to try to alleviate some of the food insecurity. Hungry children can't learn. Homelessness, we have to deal with the homelessness in our communities. Someone just asked me if I had to reimagine education post-COVID, what would I think? I think that, and perhaps there is, and I just am not aware of it. I know with some of the Promise projects, there was some expectation and we didn't fully realize it. was that you have to have interdependence between the children of the health and human services and housing and education, the things that create the ecology so kids can have the basic threshold needs in their lives. And so when it comes to schools, what we want teachers to do is to produce the same outcomes from all kids, but some of the kids are coming to school hungry. Some of the kids are coming to school where the parents are unemployed. Some of the kids are coming to school, there's no health care. So I think the system's got to meet and work together. Okay, full stop. Okay, well, what if we can't do all of that, people ask? Then I think you're just going to have to deal with the relative. And the relative is really problematic because I'm not sure we'll have full convergence across groups ever. Because as I said, you got kids on elevators, some on escalators, and some on stairwells with missing handrails and broken steps. But you can meet basic needs by having fully experienced, thoughtful, culturally sensitive, sociologically aware educators in place. You have to also make sure that the curriculum material is speaking to multiple experiences, that it's sustaining, that it's engaging. I mean, one of the things that I'm really noticing right now is thinking about the things that engage children at a certain level, that kind of, and in this COVID moment, it's really hard for our teachers, but I think Berkeley, with the online resources and technology, we've been doing it as well as we can. And I'm actually impressed with some of the material. I think though even the sights and sounds and the materials that we assign, I've been grappling with the readers, for young readers, how they don't even reflect the family structures. You know, in my case, I have two moms in my household with a 7-year-old kid, and we read a lot of heteronormative books. I find that really problematic, and that's not the district's fault, but it shows a niche that actually needs to be fulfilled. I need to start seeing more Black and brown children in the books. They need to be more multicultural. I think we're lucky in some of our districts because I've been happy with my son's teachers. But I think the expectations is around also understanding child development enough. In some countries, and I'm speaking outside of my lane a little bit, we're not expecting our children to be so regimented. They're not expecting children to be so regimented at age 6 and 7. I was astonished that my child was expected to be reading by the end of first grade. I certainly wasn't. He still wanted to play. And so I wonder if some of these divergencies, to go back to your earlier question, Professor Kolesas, has to do with the fact that we're also not thinking developmentally appropriate as first and second and third grade. And so I would love to check in on that, because in some of our peer nations, they're not starting kids to 7. They understand the value of play. They have the flexibility, discovery, imagination. And is it that our curriculum is doing that, or are we too busy trying to get our kids to do well on some standardized tests by the first grade? I resent that, honestly, as a parent.
Yeah, sorry, but yes, definitely, because once you have to check in the boxes about the standardized tests, so then you have less time for art, less time for play, and that's and that's a reality. I have one more question for you, but I'm going to be respectful of the audience because I had my time. So if you had, so Peter Panagopoulos asked, if you had one program to recommend to Joe Biden, what would that be?
There's so many. The reality is, I might get in trouble for this, but I do wonder if we need to expand the federal government's role in American public education. Mm-hmm. With it being so fundamentally decentralized, you have over 13,000 districts in the country, in the 50 states, and all of them run their separate systems. And the federal government, you know, we have the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, where Title I and all of that falls under that. And we have now Every Student Succeeds Act. But really the states, all the actions at the state and local level, I would want, because the reason why I would want the federal government to expand this role in terms of monitoring the quality of education and creating an equity portfolio for how to run schools, is that we can manage it better from a centralized perspective. the Office of Civil Rights might have a better grasp of making sure that there is implementation fairly across. I mean, I think it's important to understand. Someone wrote in one of the questions. I agree that we spend so much more on the military and actually on other social welfare programs in this country, including the social welfare for the rich through our tax code, that we don't think enough about what the input of education, which is the most fundamental institution in American society next to the family. Mm-hmm. And we don't invest in it. And that would make education more of a public good. But I actually need to talk to my legal scholar friends, because I'm actually about to embark on my own project about what if we made education a fundamental right. You know, it's not a fundamental right in the United States. So I would actually want the Biden administration to first go into engage in a commission on what if education were made a fundamental right in American society. Because right now it means that you could just give the most mediocre, the basics, and treat students and not care that a lot of our kids are getting nothing.
It's not by chance that, you know, education is not a fundamental right, and actually voting is also not covered in the Constitution either. And they're not unrelated.
Well, and we see what has happened to the erosion of voting patterns with the erosion of the Voting Acts, right? So, yeah, these things are interrelated in our society in many ways.
If you want to take one question, there are so many questions. I want to take
Let me see, because I know if you have one, you've described so many levers that have created that what are the top 2 levers we could push that would be in reversing the status quo? Well, so I will argue, if it's not clear to me, even though I focus on education, I'm a sociologist and I think structurally a lot. And so I would, you could ask me, what is one structural lever you would take? What is one kind of community-based lever you would take, and what is one school-based or lever that you would, or lever that you would take? I think the first things first, that if I were in charge, if I could have any advising, I hope that my colleague and I call her sister friend, C.C. Rouse at Princeton, is going to be the head of the chief of economic advisor to the president-elect. I really hope that we can get a better economic policy for jobs with livable wages. We have to reduce the unemployment. I mean, that ecology alone affects and permeates the school walls. What's happening in families and communities with their access to just being able to live and survive matters. So that is one lever. We have to attend to poverty in the society. And poverty is highly racialized, just as much as wealth is highly racialized in our society. So that's one lever I would attend to. At the same time, you're asking me what's another lever that I would attend to is at the school level, I really, really fundamentally would love, it's not my area. I know Linda Darling-Hammond, and someone mentions this. She's one of my mentors and role models. She is so committed to teacher education. And I would love to pay more attention and invest in the development of the teacher corps in this country in multidimensional ways. One, I would elevate the status of teaching and show a higher level of regard and respect for the profession. A lot of people compared us to, they're like, well, how did Finland do so well in those kinds of things? Well, it's a remarkably different country, but the one thing they do is love their teachers and they train them well. And so that we would have access to good training of teachers at a multidimensional way, well paid and supported. They're not overstressed. And I think I would do, and I have something I started talking about in my school, is that we need to have well-coordinated teams in our schools so that teachers don't have to do it all. We need good school psychologists. Most schools don't have them for kids who are coming in with a lot of challenges. We need nutrition specialists. We need artists and stuff. So I would actually design schools in more humanistic ways if I could be idealistic about this. But I would first start with the teacher corps and developing it and amplifying it and the training of teachers. Well, I don't trust some of the training of teachers right now, particularly some of the alternative forms. And I would deal with the economic policy that affects the children's day-to-day lives once they leave.
Yeah, that's a great point, because in the same way that I'm going to make this challenging analogy, but I mean, in the same way that the police, everything has been defunded, and the police has to take more and more roles, including um, not allowing people to breathe, but I'm not going to go to that. I mean, the schools, given the fact that, there's economic needs, their housing need, their food need, it's more and more and more on the teachers, and the schools cannot
Yes,
solve all these problems.
they can't. They can't.
Um,
Yeah. I see some questions. How important is two-parent home statistically? What about your effective role models like doctors, lawyers? So yeah, so let's move to the family level, because a lot of people immediately move to cultural explanations. The two-parent family statistically is just a proxy for income to me. I'm not, I don't buy into the stigmatizing narrative, but that is my own personal uh, a belief. And certainly, just because you have two parents don't mean it's functional or it's the best thing for children necessarily. But what the two-parent home might be more a higher correlation is this a proxy for class and for class resources in it. It may be a proxy also. There increasingly, interestingly, the demographics show there's increasing um, a higher growth among single professional mothers in our society. It used to be that single mothers were stigmatized and single fathers because they were Black and brown. Increasingly, we're seeing more white professional moms, but I'm not seeing as much research. I'm just seeing the numbers. I wonder how the narrative will change once we take account of that. Certainly, from a social emotional learning perspective, it's probably better. I do see the difference between having two people, adults in the household versus one. But I want to respect the fact that we have multi generational households. Um, a lot of family structures are not heteronormative, or they're not conventional, father wife, and so I think that there can be effective structures. It's just whether or not the families have sufficient resources to make it comfortable for all involved.
mhm, that's great.
Yeah.
So, Laverne, Simon, what is your opinion on the credential testing called RICA? RICA. I'm not familiar with that. Exam for special education teacher candidates. Most minority teachers of color fail that test and are therefore locked out from becoming a special education teacher. I'm sure that you know Linda Darling Hammond, who's the education coordinator for the state of California. She tried to get rid of that test because there are so few special education teachers in California and nationwide.
Yeah, so Linda is the president of the State Board of Education for the state of California. This is not my area of expertise. I don't know how to answer that question other than to say that I think the tests have stifled needs when it comes to shortages, and they can stifle creativity and thought about, and also potential can block and sort and select in a way that potentially block out a lot of powerful talent. So, but I don't know anything about the test, so I can't really speak authoritatively about it. I just know that I distrust tests right now, because I see the tests or proxies for most. Every time I see tests, I ask, what is it a proxy for? And I don't necessarily see them as the best signs of talent. And that might be why Professor Darling Hammond is actually is it well developed? Is it valid? Is it a reliable indicator? Probably not. If she's arguing that, I trust Linda a lot.
Mm-hmm. The next question, Bernadette Walter. What are successful examples of public school funding shifting from a local to a regional and therefore more equitable in basis?
I don't know. I'm not a funding expert. I think what I've been watching is I've been curious about how well we were going to do in this state with the local control area funding formula. And I know there are some researchers who are tracking that. The problem is it's not standardized how different districts use it. So I don't know. You're not comparing apples to apples when you do the research. But I would like to see whether or not districts that who are amassing some of these additional funds, if they're doing better. I suspect I already know what some folks are going to come out and show based on some historical analysis about equitable funding. But we'll see what happens. I don't know enough yet, and I'm not aware people going from local to regional. I'm not aware of any studies.
Yeah, there are attempts in California to do that. I'm wondering, Ellen Pechman, I'm wondering how our deeper understanding of the role of caste dominance in our society can be used to reframe how we think about educational opportunities and goals in today's schools.
Yeah, well, I'm not quite. I'm assuming that you're referring to Isabel Wilkerson kind of recasting and elevating or illuminating the notion of the caste in society. I haven't read her new book yet, but I mean, it is the case that one of the reasons why I asked the question of what if education were a fundamental right? I wonder if education were a fundamental right, could that help us to redress the historical wrongs of our society? Because it would be incumbent upon the federal government to get certain things right and state governments to work in concert with them. And so I really want to investigate this question because we're at a moment now where everyone's talking about structural racism, economic exploitation, anti-Blackness in our society, historic reparations. Well, how are we going to get there? If we don't actually address some of these issues head on. And one of the things is, it's true that we do have something akin to a caste system in this country, because when you look at the overall well-being indicators, they're so highly racialized, and the same groups are in the bottom three rungs of everything. And how do we redress that? The question is, do we have the political will? For me, that's getting into political science and such. Do we have the political will in our society? Man, when I look at what happened, and I'm going to get controversial here, when I look at what happened to Prop 16, where people see one means of trying to redress is to try to open up access, and how that got reframed as reverse discrimination or reverse racism, I realized that we have a long way to go to try to convince a lot of members of our society about what we need to do to help others who have been historically denied opportunity.
Yeah, that's a great point. I remind everyone, we discussed this in the past, but it was the repeal of Prop 209 about affirmative action. And this goes to the core. I mean, seeing education as a fundamental right, and the same thing about Prop 16, besides, the conundrum is basically California voting blue, but yes, these very fundamental issues are untouched. And this goes to, I mean, I'm going to toot my own horn here. No, I'm joking. But there is an issue that, I mean, that you bring up, which is, it's an individualistic society, and this is seen as a zero-sum game. As long as it's seen as a zero-sum game, a fundamental right to education is going to be seen as you win, I lose. That's right. And affirmative action is going to be seen as you win, I lose. So, Jean Oggins, some minority students are trying to advance their careers by enrolling in mediocre or poor for-profit online schools. Can you say something about this?
Well, we know Tracy McMillan Cotton, who is a sociologist and another MacArthur Award winner just this past year. She's a sociologist who's actually written a great book called Lower Ed Education on how those for-profit online schools, she was a former admission officer, so she had some insider knowledge, have exploited, and predominantly women of color, lower income and working class women of color, Black and Latinx women. And I think the research is showing, I mean, these populations of students get so drawn into massive debt for credentials where the returns are not that great. And many of them don't even finish, but they're enmeshed in lots of debt. It's not my area of expertise, but I can direct your attention to her book, Lower Ed, which really gets into this.
That's great. Would you, I mean, I'm going to email you so the resources that some I know, but if you can just list them, because then they ask me about, the resources you mentioned. A lot of people read a lot of references that we discussed. So We have two more questions. I mean, we have a few minutes. I'm gonna read it both. I don't want to abuse your generosity, you know, with time. So Malcolm Gison, the San Francisco Black Jewish and Allies Unity Group is composed of over 100 social activists who want to address the issues you raised in your presentation. In our 5-year existence, we have focused on criminal justice and prison reform and on elections because the issues you raised have been addressed for 50 years with too little progress. Why can't we take every child born to an indigent family and put those children in a cocoon that assures they will receive a quality education, safe and secure housing, and the mental and physical health services they need through age 18? That's one question. The other, by Francis Pinnock, I really appreciate your remarks about shifting the purpose of education to democracy building and citizenship, an issue, by the way, that you work a lot on, and we didn't develop that much here. My family is white and we live in a very affluent neighborhood in San Francisco, though we're middle class. As I saw Black Lives Matter sign going on at my blog, I decided not to post if Black Lives Matter send your children to public school. Would that have been a fair provocation to start a decision of systemic racism in the US? That's very Francis, by the way.
Yeah, let me just say, I'll answer let me take the first one because there are some. I appreciate this. The first persons who came to mind when I heard as I read the question from Malcolm Gibson is that I think of my colleagues and my former office mate, Derek Hamilton, who is a well-known stratification economist. He and William Darity now have been making the argument about baby bonds and how the United States is wealthy enough to guarantee and start a baby bond account for every child. It'd be means tested. So, but every child, it's a universal program, would be given a certain amount, and certainly more affluent children may not necessarily be given as much, but that this would grow over the course of 18 years so that children who grow up in very indigent circumstances would have something to send them off. And they've done an economic analysis to show what that could do. It wouldn't fully minimize or eradicate the kind of vast non-normal differences we have across race and class, but it would do something to at least elevate the thresholds of living and improve the opportunities for more education and better mobility for groups that have been historically economically marginalized. So baby bonds were something they tinkered with in the UK for a while, but I don't know if really many nations have done it. See, the problem is industrialized European nations, democratic nations, they just have much better social safety nets for their people. The countries are not as big as the US, of course, but they take care of their people well. Canada, the best example is our neighbor to the north, where Canada, which is a much larger and diverse society, takes care of its people in terms of healthcare, housing. They're actually doing some really interesting experiments with housing and so forth now. And so that the economic disparity, the Gini coefficient, the gap between the haves and the have-nots is just not as vast as it is in this country. So I think that there are some different economic policies that could be implemented. To go to the second point about, it's a really interesting, tough decision, a thought. I've never quite understood how San Francisco, such a wealthy metropolitan city, municipality, and I don't know the history well enough, but so many people choose to send their children to private schools in that city. Well, first of all, there are more pets than there are children in the city, I understand, but that's a city that could be a model for the country. And I do think that that's where those controlling stereotypes and narratives have just completely created a lot of myopia, in social myopia in the lives and minds of a lot of people in the city. And the district is working its hardest. It's one of our best performing districts in the state, primarily because there's the high achieving students, particularly on the west side of the city. The Chinese and Asian American students do very well on the test. if you use the test as a metric. But there's a lot of fear in that city, and I just don't get it. But I do get it because that's how racism and ethnocentrism works. Um, would it be? It's a provocation. The reality is, in some parts of the country, and I'm grappling with this now with a relative of mine who's saying, look, it is true that the public schools are just bad. How could you ask me to take this chance? So I think there would have to be some political mobilization and community building and from the ground up to try to create context where people feel safe and secure, to want to en masse send more of their children to school. So I don't want to be overly idealistic. I do have to be a bit pragmatic here. But I think it's possible if communities would come together and say, we're going to do this, and this is how we're going to operate together. And this is how we're going to work with the school board. And this is how we're going to maintain schools in our communities to be better. But you got to have the will, and you got to have the time and the energy.
Yes, that's a great point. And during this pandemic, which was one of the points, I wanted to ask, but a lot of families who could not, have the kids at home had to pull, their kids from public school, and those families who could do it to private school. And what you're doing that, unwantedly is actually further erode the public system. So it's a very vicious cycle.
Yes, it's a vicious cycle.
It's a very vicious cycle. So I don't want to leave on the very vicious cycle note, but we came, to the time that I really, really value. It was an amazing conversation. I would rather, end with reminding, the audience your point about, education as a fundamental right, and education as a leverage for democratic inclusion, and the rapport between education and democracy, and all the work that we have to do and that you are contributing to with your research and expertise. So thank you very much, and thank you, the audience. Thanks, the team at the From Institute. It was my pleasure.
It was my pleasure. I appreciate the time and the engagement. Thank you so much for all your questions.
Thank
you, Dean Carter, and thank you, Professor Kolesas, for organizing all of this. Thank you to the staff, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today.